Okay, so good morning, guys. For this class, we'll continue from where we stopped in JavaScript, but for the sake of those that weren't here for yesterday's class, I'll be going over the class again. So basically, the contents of this class has been divided into three sections. So for the first section, that's within the content that you can see on the screen, we have that to be practical recap on the last class. So this particular section would actually be beneficial for those who were not here yesterday and also for those who were here and had some small complaints that they couldn't really grasp everything at once. So no need to worry, we'll go over it again. So the main content of today's class is actually the section 2 and 3. And you can see that section 2 has something to do with JavaScript keywords. So under this section, we'll get to know what a JavaScript script keyword is. Already, we are already aware of some JavaScript keywords from yesterday's class. That's for those who were there. We treated the var keyword, the let keyword, and the const keyword. Now, those are not the only keywords in JavaScript. There are quite a lot of them, and I think there are 63 in number. So you'll probably be seeing all of them in this section. That's when we get to the examples of the JavaScript keywords. So for the last section, we have JavaScript data types. Now, under this section, we'll be getting to know what a JavaScript data type is, and we'll also see the categories of data types we have in JavaScript. Now, JavaScript has up to seven, data types or eight, but then these data types are divided into two categories, mainly the primitive data types and the advanced data types. So for the sake of simplicity and also because of time, we'll only be taking the primitive data types in this class. So continue from there in our next class on Monday. So for the first section of today's class, practical recap on the last class. So without wasting much of our time, let's quickly go over what we had yesterday. So now we are back, to VS Code. And for the sake of those that were not here, I'll be starting the entire process from the very beginning. So we'll be getting rid of all this. Okay, I think that's enough. So for this, we'd have a new HTML file we'll be making use of. We'll call this index2.html. Of course, you know what we'll do next. Make use of the boilerplate. Next, we'll create a JS file. Now in this folder, there's no JS file yet. So to do this, all you need to do is come here and you give a name to the JS file. So we'll call this main.js. Now we have both the HTML file and the JavaScript file. So the next thing we'll do now is reference this JS file now HTML. And we can actually do that in the head section or in the body section. But because we'd be making, references to HTML elements, it's always better you have it in the body section. And for this, you're going to have it at the end of the body section and not at the beginning. So what this means basically is that this particular script tags, these script tags we have here, they would be at the base here. So we would have our elements above it that's beginning in this space. So next we would call the JavaScript file, which we use, the source attribute to do that. This is main.js. main.js. Now we have everything set and ready. So a quick recap on the first section of yesterday's class was what a variable was. And like I said before, a variable basically is a named container that is used for storing data or value of any type. Now, this variable is actually a name that you would actually create by yourself. It's not something that exists out there. So this name could be any name of your choice. It could be a variable called username. It could be a variable called last name. It could be a variable called first name. Be a variable, you can actually name it however you want. But one thing to know is that you can never have a keyword as a variable name. And when we get to the keyword section, you would see the particular words in JavaScript that you should never use as a variable name. So you need to be careful when naming variables. That's one thing you need to know of. Try as much as possible not to use keywords as variable names. Now back to what a variable, I already said it's a named container used for storing data or value of any types. And on the screen now, we have three examples of what a variable name could look like. Now, another thing we should know about is the fact that to reference the values that are being assigned to these variables, we would actually do that by making use of the name. So let's assume username is assigned a value which is of a string type. Let's say my own name, Edward. Now, for me to reference this Edward here, I would have to do that by, making use of this variable name that is actually here. But now you can see that we've not really dived into using it in JavaScript. This is just for explanatory purposes. So when we get to this the main.js, you would actually see how to make use of these variable names. So before we go on, one thing we should know about is the fact that there are some keywords that are used to declare these variables. And the keywords we have are the var keyword, the let keyword, and the const keyword. Now, these are the keywords that are used when it comes to declaring the variable names. And also, you can declare the variable names with nothing. So this is actually like the fourth option, but most times it's always advisable never to use this. You should always make use of either the var, the let, or the const when it comes to declaring variables. So, like I said in yesterday's class concerning the var, which is the first one we have, the var keyword is an old keyword that was used for naming variables. It's not really used anymore. So, for the purpose of just knowledge wise stuff, I would actually show you guys how this keyword works. But then when it comes to professional practice, it's always advisable not to use the var keyword as it is not really used anymore in JavaScript. And that's probably because the var and the let keyword, they kind of do the same thing. The let keyword is like a modernized version of the var, so it's always better you just abandon the older one. But it still works in JavaScript regardless, so no need to worry about that. So next we have the let keyword, which like I said, it does the same job with the var keyword, only that it's more recent. And lastly, we have the const keyword. Now, this keyword is quite unique from the two. It also does the same thing when it comes to declaring variables. But the only problem here, or okay, not really a problem, but the unique thing here is the fact that with the const keyword, you can actually declare a constant value. So what this means is that the value you would have when you declare a variable with this const cannot change. For the var and the let, they can always change anytime you want them to change. But for this one, it cannot change. And I'm guessing the const keyword is actually short for constant. So when you hear the word constant, you will know that that particular thing is just the way it is. It can't change. So that's how the keywords are. And like I said, the last option, we have nothing, which is basically declaring the variable without any of these keywords. Your variable would still work, but it's not advisable to do that. So without wasting much of our time, let's put these keywords into practice. So for this, we'll be going back to our JS file and we'll be making use of comments for this variable declaration.
You can't see your screen again. Or is it?
Okay, can you see the screen?
It's not showing yet.
Okay,
Yes, yes, yes. The screen is okay.
it's
The screen
okay.
is okay. You can see the
This is why
screen.
this is your network.
Okay, you can see the screen.
Yes, yeah, we can all see the screen. I'm sure it's from his own side.
Okay, no problem. So without wasting time, let's quickly see how these keywords actually work. So we have the first keyword, which is the var keyword. Now, like I said before, the variable name can be anything you want. So I could call this first name, and now I have declared this particular variable name called first name with the var keyword. I could also have it, with the other keyword, which is let, and I'll call this variable last name. Now we have two variable names, but they are declared with different keywords, which actually still do the same thing. Now,
Sir, hope sir.
yeah,
Hope the class is recorded, sir.
yeah, sure, it is. Okay, so the next thing we'll do here is that now in JavaScript, you can actually have your variables to be declared this way without a value. And by doing it like this, this is actually known as variable declaration. Now, there's something called variable initialization. And by variable initialization, it basically means when you add a particular value to the variable name. Now we've only declared these variables. That's this variable of first name and last name with the var and the let. The next thing we'll be doing would be initializing it. And for us to do that, we would need to add a value to this first name. So for the first name, we can have this to be Edward. And for the second, we can have this to be Liaza. Now we have two variable names. You should always make use of the semicolon to separate your statements. Although it would work, but it's just best practice you do so. Now we do not have this to be, variable declared, but now we have this to be declared and initialized. So now you can see that there's a difference between just declaring a variable and declaring and initializing a variable. This variable here has been declared and initialized. So the moment I take off this value here, the variable now is only just declared and it has not been initialized. So now in JavaScript, there are actually two ways you could initialize a variable. Now you can initialize a variable at the initial point, which we've done here, that's on this second line, or you can initialize the variable later on. So what this means is that JavaScript actually allows you to declare now and initialize later on. So what I'll do here is instead of adding the value here, I would come down here and say first name is equals to Edward. Now you can see that right here we've only declared only and now initialized. But for this one, that's okay. Let's just take this to the top. Yeah, so now for the first line where we have the let keyword, you can see that this has been declared and initialized. But for the second one, we've only declared on one line, and on another line, we initialize the variable. So one thing you should know is that you only declare a variable once, just once. So you don't need to come here and say var again, first name equals to Edward. You've already declared it here. You don't need to declare again. So declaration only works once. And mind you, this might not give you an error, but it's just better you don't declare twice. Just declare it once. So the moment you've done that on this line, in the next line, you all you need to do is to just assign the variable name a value, or better still, you just declare and initialize at once, as we can see here. So the next keyword we'll be touching is the const keyword. Now, the const keyword, like I said, is quite different from the let and the var, and that's because the let and the var keyword would actually allow you to declare at a particular moment and then come back to initialize. So let's just do that for the let keyword. So we'll have this to be let $name. For those that were here, you know that this is actually a proper variable name, even with the $sign. But for the sake of those that were not here, I would explain why we have this $sign here. So don't worry about that. So here would only declare this keyword, call this declared only, and then we'll come back on another line and initialize this, call this sale virtual. Now we have this to be initialized here. So now you can see that with both the let and the var keyword, you can actually declare on one line and initialize on another line, or you could do it just on one line here. So we could also have this, all this, okay, change this to var. I will call this one $name 2. Give this a different value, tech student. So now you can see with the let and the var, you can either have it to be this way or this way. So let's just take everything here. So now we have the let on a particular space and we have the var keyword on a particular space. So now you can see that you have an option to declare and initialize, or you can declare first and come back to initialize. But for the const keyword, declaring on a single line is not allowed. That's declaring first and coming back to initialize is not allowed for the const keyword. So the const keyword cannot accept something like, let's have a variable name, call this name 3. Now you can see that we have a red marker under the variable name, and this is because it's a wrong syntax. So for us to correct this, we must always initialize it when we are using the const keyword. So we just call this sale program. So you can see that now we have quite a difference between the let and the var, and also the const. The const will not allow you to, it won't allow you to do this. Let's assume we have name 3, then we'll come down here to do name 3 equals to, say, find worker. The const keyword will not allow this at all. This entire syntax is wrong. So to correct this, we are going to take this off, and would also copy this to this line. So now you know that for the let keyword, it must always be declared and initialized at once. You can't have it declared on one line, initialized on another line. It's not possible, it's wrong. That's how the cons keyword actually works. So the last option we have is declaring it with nothing, without any keyword. So for us to do that, all I'll just have here is a variable name without a keyword. So we just call this $name for. I would give this any value of our choice. Now you can see that we've been working mostly with the string type, which is why you have text within the double quotes. I would explain that when we get to JavaScript data types. So now you have this. Now this particular syntax here is actually correct, but this is what you would actually call an undeclared variable. So you can see that for the other ones, we've actually been having them to be declared, 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 declared. But here we have this to be undeclared. So what this means is that this particular variable here does not really have a declaration type. You can't really say what it is. But then one thing to know is that by default, this actually holds the var type. So it's kind of equivalent with this. So having this and having this, as these two lines we can see here on number line 21 and 23, they are equivalent, they are the same. So by default, this one here that is undeclared actually appears to be like this. That's when the JavaScript is rendered on the browser. So the browser takes it to be this way. So another thing we should also note is that when you declare a variable only, let's go back to the to the first part of the screen. So now we have the let $name on this line. So this has been declared only but not initialized yet. We just initialized it later on this line. So let's assume this wasn't there. Let's comment this out. And let's also comment this out too. Now for these variables that have been declared only, that's on line 4 and on line 12, they actually still hold a value. So you might not know this, but this variable still has a value. The only thing here is that the value for this variable is called the undefined value. Now, this undefined value is not something that you can see on the screen. As you can see, I did not assign it the value of undefined. It's very obvious that it stops exactly on this line. That's after this name. There's no text there except for the comment. But then this variable actually holds a value that is called undefined. And this value is the default value for any variable that has only been declared and not initialized. So until we actually come here to do this and give it a value here, this variable would actually hold the undefined value. So the undefined value is like an invincible value. You can't see it on VS Code, but when you check for the type, that's the data type for this particular variable, it would actually show you to be undefined. So we'll actually see how to do that later on when we get to the data type section. So the next thing I'll be doing now would be to print these values on the screen. And for those who were here in yesterday's class, I showed you how to do that. We'll be printing the values we have here by making use of the document.get element by ID method. Now, this method allows us to print directly on an HTML element. So what this means is that we'll go back to our HTML element and we'll be creating some tags there. I mean our HTML file. We'll go there. Now, many of us are conversant with the p tag, but now I'll be making use of heading tags too. So let's make use of the heading 3 probably a heading 4. Now, before I move on, going back to the JS file, this particular method can only affect HTML tags with element. So you can see the method name here is document.getElement by ID. So what this means is that it's going to get the element that it's meant to affect by the ID itself. So for us to actually make this affect our HTML elements, that's here, we'd have to give each of these elements an ID name. So this particular method here that we can see here, it doesn't work for a class name or the tag name. It only works for the ID name. So going back to our HTML file, I'll give this paragraph an ID. We all know what an ID name is, a unique name, cannot be repeated. I'll call this P1. Now we can even decide to have, a text here. Let's just say sail program. Okay, we've already used sail in our JS. Let's give this another text. Good morning, class. Now, if I save this and I render it on the browser, that's by opening with live server, we have good morning class on the screen. So you can see that this is actually rendered by the element itself without JavaScript affecting it yet. So now I'll go back to our JS file, get element by ID. It's followed by a bracket, and inside this bracket you would have the double quotes. In double quotes, you would actually have the ID name. So back to our HTML file, we have the ID name here to be P1. So the P1 goes here, P1. The next part of this method will be the dot inner HTML. Now by default, this is how you actually have the entire method to look like. So the only thing you'll be putting here is just the your ID name, which is P1. Next, you would give this what you want to display on the browser. So now we'll give this a string, which is a data type for textual data. We'll call this good afternoon, everyone. Now the funny thing here is that the moment we save this and we go back to our browser, you are not going to see the actual content that was rendered by the HTML element before. This particular string we have here, which is good afternoon everyone, would actually override the good morning class. And so when I save this, I go back to the browser, you actually have this to be good afternoon everyone. So this is one of the dynamic things that JavaScript can allow you to do. Now if we go back to our HTML file, you can see that the good morning class still appears here. It doesn't, the JavaScript doesn't come from the browser into our VS Code and changes it. No, it still remains here. But now we've used JavaScript to override this content we have here. And we've actually referenced that by, using this string directly. So the next thing we'll do now is to reference it by the variable names we've created. So I'll take this off. And like I said before, to reference a particular value, let's assume we want to print out Eliaza, which is on this second line here. For us to print out this value, we would reference this by the variable name, which is last name. So what I would do here is that I would assign this particular method the variable name of last name. If I save this, the next thing we would have on our browser would be my name, which is here. So you can see how JavaScript works with the let keyword. Or what keyword were we? Yes, the let keyword. So next we'll reference this by another variable name, which is this one we've declared here and initialized here. So for us to do that, we change this to $name. And now if we save this, we are going to have save virtual on the screen. Okay, save virtual. If I go back, now we have save virtual right here. So you can see that this particular text here is actually printed on the p tag, but then it is connected with a JavaScript method, which is why we don't have the default content within the p tag. So let's make use of another element. We'll give this an ID of, we'll call this head 3. That's the ID name for this heading. So the next one will be reference will be for the var keyword where we have this text student. So for this, I would leave the the one for the let. We'll create another method here. Document dot get element by ID. Here would have the element name head one dot inner HTML, and this would be equals to the variable which holds the value for text student $name 2. So here we have $name 2. Save this, and now if we should go back to our browser, we would have the value for this name 1, that's this $name rendered by the p element, and would have the one for name 2 rendered by the heading element. So what this means basically is that you are going to see a difference in the size of the text. Remember, the heading tags are always bigger than the p tags. We already know that. So here on the browser, okay, heading 3. Okay, we don't need to put any content here. Okay, so saving this, normally we are expected to see a change here, but then no need to worry, we'll just change this to the p tag. Hopefully it always works with the paragraph tags. Okay, oh, I know the problem now. It was a typo. So here we had the ID name to be head 3, but in the main.js we had it to be head 1. So this is meant to be head 3, and if I save this now, it should actually render content. Yes, so now you can see we have the one rendered by the p tag to be sale virtual, and the heading 3 tag renders text student. Now these two texts are rendered by JavaScript methods. So the next demonstration would be on the first name. So for this, we'll uncomment this one. We'll change this name to actually be first name. So now if I save this and I go back to the browser, we should see for the name, for the $name, we have it to be sale virtual. For the first name, we have Edward. So you should see Edward below the sale virtual, which we already have here. So the final demo would be on the const value. I mean the const keyword, which we already have here to be $name 3. So I'll change, okay, I'll leave this, create another method for that. And we'll be using another ID name. So we'll go back to our HTML. We'll give this heading 4 an ID of head 4. Now, I hope we all know that irrespective of whether you put a content here or not, the JavaScript would always override it. So even if we actually have this content here, heading 4, which we already know when we save this, you would actually see it on the browser to be heading 4. But the moment we connect it with a JavaScript method dot inner HTML, would give this the variable that was declared with the const keyword, which is dollar sign name 3. So now this would override what we have there, and what you would see instead of heading 4 would be find worker. Now we have find worker right here. So you can see how unique this JavaScript is. It affects different HTML elements, mostly the textual ones. But for simplicity, we'd only be dealing with text elements. So for the next part of today's class, we have the JavaScript identifiers. So for those who were not here yesterday, a JavaScript identifier is basically a name that is given to a variable, function, object, arrays, or etc. So now you can see that we have these variable names on the screen, name 3 on this line. We have the first name on this line, and we have the name here on this line. So what this means basically is that every variable name we have in this JS file, that's from the very beginning of this code to this last line, they are all identifiers. So this means that an identifier can actually be a variable name, can also be a function name, and it can also be an array name. Likewise, an object name, and any other one we have out there. But mostly these are you know the most ones you'll be dealing with: the variable name, function name, array name, and object name. So you can see the name 3, we have the first name, dollar sign name, dollar sign name 3. We have the last name here, dollar sign name, name here, name 2, first name. Let's just list everything out that we have as a variable name. So for the variable names here, that's in this file, we've had the dollar sign name. We've also used the dollar sign name 2. Also made use of dollar sign name 3. We've made use of the dollar sign name 4. We've also used the last name and the first name. I think that's all variable names we have here. Okay, yes, that's all. So all these variable names, they are all identifiers. So irrespective of the keyword that was used to declare them, whether it's a const keyword, a let keyword, a var keyword, or they were declared with nothing, they are all identifiers under the variable scope. So for this now, we've actually seen different variable names under the variables. So the next one we'll be seeing now is how the function name looks like. And so for that, we'll be having a quick demo on what a function looks like. So for the function, you begin with the function keyword. Next, you give it a name. So you can see that just the same way we gave our variables a name, we will also give the function a name. So for this, I'll call this my function. After the function name, you would have the normal brackets, then you have the curly braces. Now this is exactly how you have a basic syntax of a function. So you can see it begins with the function keyword, and like I said before, a keyword cannot be a name. So we cannot have this to be function function. We can't call the name of this function. You can see it already highlights a red marker here, which shows that it's wrong. So you must never use a keyword as a name to name a variable, function, object, or array. We also can't have var here. You can see we have a red marker below it, which shows that it's an error. If I should change this to let, this is actually wrong. But I think it you can see here it gives you void. And also I change this to const, red marker. So you can see that you can never have a keyword to be a function name or an identifier. So for this, we'll go back to my function, which we already used. And now we have a quick syntax of what a function looks like. So for the function, you can actually have your JavaScript codes to be within this space here. That's this entire space we have here. That's within this curly braces is where your codes will go in. So the identifier here under this function is actually the my function. So the my function here is actually an identifier that's under the function name. Also, the next one we'll be seeing would be an example of what an object looks like. So for the object, create a separate space for this. So for the object, the normal object would actually begin with a keyword which you use to declare it, and then you would have an object name. For this, let's just call this boys. Now the object begins with the square brackets, and in the square brackets you would have your items within that object. So for this, we'd have a couple of strings. Call this gday, Ahmed, Samuel. Now we
Can you single quote? Can you single quote as well, right?
hmm? I didn't get you.
I said, can you single quotes? Because if you're using double quotes, like Jude,
Yeah, yeah,
Ahmed,
yeah,
Amo, can
sure.
I use single quotes?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thank you. So something here to note is that for string type, you cannot also use single quotes or double quotes. So we can have this to be a single quote here. Anyhow you want it, JavaScript will interpret both quotes correctly. So this is an example of what an object looks like very, very briefly. And you can see here the identifier we have here is actually the object name, which is boys. So boys here is the identifier. So let's just create another object real quick. Call this girls.
Sorry, is this an array or object?
No, no, this is object. This is object. We'll get to array very soon. So this is just for object. So the next object will have some female names here. Call it Lola. Let me see. Say Angel. So here we have two separate objects which have been declared with the const keyword. Now you can see that the identifiers we have under the object scope is actually boys and girls. So for the last one we'll be seeing, that would be the arrays. So for the array types, we also begin by declaring, what the array would be. So this is going to have a constant, value, and you give this an array name. So we'll call this a car. And for the arrays, you don't have square brackets. You actually have this to maintain curly braces here. So A quick introduction to what an array is. An array is actually what they call a key value pair. So by key value pair, we mean you have a particular key in the array and it is always assigned with a value. So to make it very simple, let me show you what that actually means. So for the car here, would have the brand. So just imagine the key value pair to be a particular property that holds a value. That's a property of that object name. So you can, I mean, a property of that array name. So you can see that the array name we have here is car. So let's just define some properties of a car. So I begin with a brand. For the brand, we'll have, let's go for a popular car brand. Let's say Mercedes Benz. Another property we can have is the model, because there are different models of Mercedes Benz. For the model, you would have this to be, let's say, ML 450. That's it. So another property would have is the kind of, the wheel drive. So the drive here would hold the value of a four-wheel drive. So you can see that the array and the object, they are quite different. For the array, it begins with curly braces, while for the object, it begins with normal square brackets. So like I said before, the array is actually it actually holds its own value in key value pairs. So the key here most times is actually the property of the array name. So here we have an array name of car, and we have three properties under this array name: brand, model, and drive. Now each of these properties has their own specific values. So the array here is not like your variable or your object or function that has a particular, value. Here you can have multiple values with multiple properties. For the brand here, we have this to be Mercedes Benz. For the model, we have this to be ML 450 because there are different models out there. And also for the drive, we have this to be four-wheel drive because some cars are less. Also, we can have another constant too. We'll call this player, or can call this country. So we'll call this nation. That will be the first value. We would have Nigeria.
America then.
Okay. I just wanted, people we already know Nigeria, so not much of an issue anyway. But for simplicity, let's go Nigeria since we know a lot about our country. The next thing we'd have here will be states, which we already know the number. They are 36. You could also add some properties of the country, president. Okay, let's just leave that. Um, what could we add? Any other thing about the country, you could just keep adding properties and assigning them values. So for the array and for the object, we already have classes dedicated for this. So this isn't going to be the complete um class for the two of them, but the purpose why we dived into this is because of the identifiers we have here. So you can see under the array name we have our identifiers to be car and country. So these are the identifiers here. For the object, the identifiers here are boys and girls. And also for the function, we have the function name to be an identifier right here, my function. So if we're to have a list of the entire identifiers on this JavaScript file, all these JavaScript identifiers would have them to, to begin with this, that's the entire variable name here. They are all identifiers under the variable scope. We also have the function that we have. Next, we'd have the array the object identifiers there, which is boys and girls. Lastly, we would have our array identifiers, which is car and country. So all this right here, all of them, they are all JavaScript identifiers. All of them, all. So that means that the JavaScript identifier here is like the umbrella of naming things in JavaScript. So within this umbrella, we have the variable name, which we already have from here to here. Then next we have the function name, which is this. Next we have the object name, and lastly we have the array name. So they are all identifiers. So just know that a variable name is an identifier, a function name is an identifier, an object name and an array name are also identifiers. So the identifier is just the general name that they are all called. But specifically, if you were to go in depth, you would only call this ones here variable names. For this, you would call this function names. For this, you call this object names, and for this, you call this array names. But all together, they are all identifiers. So the next thing we'll be seeing here is the rules that we should always follow when naming identifiers. Because like I said before, we have this dollar sign to appear in these names, and it's actually legal in JavaScript to have it this way. So for those that were here in yesterday's class, they already know this. But then for people who are here today, no problem. We'll go over it again. So the first rule we have is the fact that an identifier name must be unique. So this is the first rule. So you can see that within all these names we have used here, there is no particular identifier that is actually the same with the next one. Here we have name, here we have dollar sign name 2, dollar sign name 3, dollar sign name 4, last name, first name. There is no particular identifier we've used in today's class that has been repeated. They are all different. So that's the first rule. The identifier name must be unique. The second we should know about is the fact that an identifier must always, this is always, must always begin with letters which could be in uppercase, that's capital letter A to Z, or small letter A to Z. So I know I've not really done that, but then it's still legal. So for the sake of this, I'll change this to capital C, car, change this to country. So now we'd have this to be car and country. So you can see that using uppercase letters and lowercase letters, you can actually begin an identifier name. Now, aside this, you can also begin with the dollar sign. So in JavaScript, it's actually legal to begin the identifier name with a dollar sign. And lastly, you can begin the identifier name with an underscore. So for the sake of this, I would convert this name 2 here to underscore name 2, and this name 4 to underscore name 4. So we are going to find where they are and have them that way. Name 2 and name 4. Yeah, changes to underscore, underscore, underscore. Okay, so I think that's that for them. So Having an identifier beginning with the underscore is legal, as well as the dollar sign is also legal, and also with the uppercase and lowercase letters. Now, one thing here we should note is that they can never begin with a digit. By that, I'm talking about 0 to 9. You can never begin an identifier name with a number, whether it's a variable name, a constant, an array name, an object name, or a function name. They must never begin with a number. So let's see how that plays out. So here, for the variable name, would have this, we'll be changing just one of this. So this last name, I would add a number here. You can see immediately I put this number, it already highlights an error. It can never begin with a number, even zero. It can begin with zero. All the numbers, just about all of them, to give you an error. If I add it here, the same. Add it here, the same thing. It can never begin with a number. Never. So this is one thing we should always take note of. Any identifier name cannot begin with a number. Okay, let's try that with functions. It can never begin with a number. Never. Now, objects, never. You can see it gives us an error. And lastly, the array, never. Never. So you must never ever begin it with a digit. So the next rule here, which is the third rule, is that the identifier name can contain, that's after the very first beginning, which starts with a letter or dollar sign or underscore. The rest of the name can actually contain letters. We already know that to be uppercase and lowercase. It can also contain the dollar sign. It can also contain the underscore. And now it can contain the digit, which is 0 to 9. So if you have this to be car 1, is actually legal, or country 23, it's legal. We can never have this to be 23 country. Wrong. So it's actually valid everywhere. You can have the number here, and also have the underscore, and also have the dollar sign. Here you choose to put it. Dollar sign is accepted everywhere. Same with the underscore, is also accepted everywhere. But the digits is only accepted after the very first, you know, letter. So you can have this to be B1, 2, 3, but you can never have this to be 1, 2, 3. It's wrong. It's accepted everywhere. This could be my function 1, 2, accepted. My function underscore, accepted. My function dollar sign, but you cannot have this to be 1, 2, my function is wrong. You can even have the underscore here, no problem. You can have the dollar sign here, still no problem. But a number cannot begin an identifier. So you can have this here. Also for variable names, it also applies. You can have the number here. But we already have this to be name 2. Okay, so you can see that even for the variables we've declared before, we follow the rule by adding a number, within the variable name and not at the beginning. So you can see for name 3, we also follow the rule here. We have 3 here with 4. So none of these numbers are beginning the variable. They can be in between the variable name or at the end, anyhow you choose to place them. But they should never begin the variable name or the identifier as a whole. So that's for the third rule. The fourth rule is the fact that spaces are not allowed. So I know some of you might be used to doing things like this. First, name or last name. You can see that VS Code already, it gives this a dash, like a strike through. This is not allowed. This is not allowed. Spaces are not allowed in variable names, or let's say spaces are not allowed in identifiers. So you can never have this to be first with space name or last with a space name. They must always be together. So we can actually try this in the variables we have. Let's assume we wanted this to be cars with a space. Let's just add a country here, America, or I think it's a German car, Germany. You can see that the space here between car and Germany is not allowed. You must take it together. Likewise, it's also not allowed here. It's not allowed. They must always be together. And it also applies with function names too. You cannot have this to be my with a space function. You can see now this particular function is no more a variable name because of the space we have here. It has now taken another purpose. Now you can see it is called a function constructor. So the purpose it was meant to serve, it's not serving it anymore, which is just as an identifier. So to correct this, we'll take out the space, and now we have this to be a function name. And also here, let's give a space between name and for. If we have a space here, it's wrong. Must always be together. So that's that for the rules of Okay, we still have some other rules. So for the fifth rule, hyphens are not allowed. Yes, hyphens are not allowed in identifiers. They are not allowed. So you cannot have something like first hyphen name or something like last hyphen name. Now the reason because of this is the fact that JavaScript interprets the hyphen as a minus symbol. So you already know what the minus symbol does. If you should say 45-8, this is actually legal. You can see there's no error highlighted here. So having the hyphen between 45 and 8 actually means 45 minus 8. So what JavaScript will interpret this as is actually going to interpret it as last minus name, which you wouldn't want. So hyphens are not allowed. You can actually try that out in every name. You would see that country, let's call this Africa, not allowed. Or we've changed this to car and Germany. Okay, let's just finish that up here. Hyphens not allowed. Boys thing not allowed. My hyphen function not allowed. You can see the purpose here of this function we've put here has changed. Also for variable names, name $ name -3 not allowed. Name -4 also not allowed. So hyphens are not allowed as identifiers. So for the sixth one, identifiers are case sensitive. So for those that were in the first class, I believe we already know what case sensitivity actually means. But if we're not there, no problem. Now, case sensitivity actually deals with how uppercase and lowercase letters are being rendered by JavaScript. Now you can have a variable name that you call man. And you can also have another variable name called man. Now both of them in some programming languages might actually be the same, but in JavaScript it renders this lowercase m and this uppercase m differently. So let's actually see why how that is. So we've actually printed some variable names already. For this, let's see, we have dollar sign name here. That's on this line, 26. So now if I should change this to an uppercase letter, despite the fact that we declared it here with lowercase, that's on line 4, we have this to be lowercase n. If I have this to be uppercase, okay, let's comment all of this out so we don't see them on the screen. So now we have this method here, which means we are expecting at least one text to appear on the screen. If we should save this and go back to our browser, we have the default HTML text on the screen now. Okay, so let me just take that out. Oh, okay, let's just comment this out. Now we've referenced this by the element with the ID of P1, which is this element that has good morning here. If we should remove this and save, if I go back to the browser, you can see that nothing displays on the browser, and that's because the dollar sign name too actually has a lowercase of n, but when we referenced it, we changed the n there to be in uppercase. So to correct this, all we need to do is to change this back to the way it was, which is the lowercase of n. If I save this now, the text save virtual appears on the browser. So this is a very, very important rule to take note of. All identifiers are sensitive or are case sensitive, all of them, all, not just the variable names, the function names, the array names, the object names, they are all case sensitive. So I think that should be all for the rules. Do we still have any more? Okay, yes, lastly, and very, very importantly, I've said this before already. Keywords cannot be used as identifiers. They can never be used. Keywords cannot be used as identifiers at all. So we already saw how that actually works when we try to, if we try to change this to this card Germany, we try to change this to const var, it doesn't work. Or const, it doesn't work. It doesn't. It's not allowed. And likewise the let also. So it doesn't work in all of them. You can never have a keyword to be an identifier. It doesn't work that way. If we should have function, which we've already tested out before, it doesn't work. Also with variable names, it just doesn't work. Doesn't work. Doesn't. It's always best you just leave the keywords out of naming variables. So those are the 7 rules we have when it comes to naming identifiers. That's variable names, function names, object names, and array names. So
Sorry, sir. What about the semicolon?
Semicolon. Okay, so the semicolon is not used in naming variables. So you can say that, semicolons are not allowed in naming variables. Are not allowed. Also, not just semicolon, even the symbols like at something, it's not allowed. So the truth here is this: when you want to name a variable, you should always follow this second rule here. That's where it says you must always begin with letters, dollar sign, and underscore. You should always follow the second and the third rule. That's if you want to name the entire variable with all the characters that are available for you. Just follow the second rule and the third rule. Do not try to add at something or hashtag something or asterisk something. Why I am saying so is because some of these symbols they already have what they've been defined with already. In case you don't know, just a sneak peek of JavaScript operators. The plus symbol in JavaScript is for addition. The hyphen symbol is for multiplication. The asterisk symbol, the hyphen symbol is for subtraction. The asterisk is for multiplication. The backslash is for division. The percentage symbol is something related to modulus. When we get to operators, I will explain what that is. The at symbol also has, what it does in JavaScript. So it's always better you leave those symbols aside and do not try naming it with things like, what's it called? Things like braces or square brackets. Don't try adding all this when you're naming variables. Normal bracket or square bracket. The thing here is this: all these symbols, they've actually, JavaScript has defined them with a purpose. You cannot even make use of the greater than sign to name variables or less than sign. You can't make use of this. You can't make use of semicolon, which I've already said, or this normal colon here. You cannot even make use of, this particular quote when naming variables. You can't make use of single quotes or even double quotes. So when it comes to naming variables, just follow rule 2 and rule 3. In fact, your variable name should actually have its characters to be between this rule 2 and rule 3. Anything outside this, it's not advised. It's not. So that you don't run into complications, many problems like that. So before we leave this section, we'll probably just go about, the variable names again. So for valid identifiers, and have variable names that begin with identifiers that begin with underscore name or dollar sign something, or you can just begin with lowercase or uppercase. These are for just a quick example. Now, like I said before, identifiers that are not allowed, or what I will call invalid identifiers, are things like first name beginning with one, not allowed, or you are trying to add a space between first and name, not allowed, or putting a hyphen here, not allowed, or some of these other symbols, not allowed, not allowed, not allowed. So basically, we already know what an invalid identifier looks like. So just try as much as possible to follow the rules that we have on the screen, and trust me, you'll be just fine. There wouldn't be any single problem with your code. So I think that's that for identifiers. So the next section we had yesterday was on something called camel case. Now, the camel case is actually a style that is used by programmers when it comes to naming variables. Now you can see that all the variables we've actually named, we didn't follow a particular style. We just did it randomly, anyhow we wanted. In as much as we followed and obeyed the rules, we just defined our variable names just exactly the way we wanted. No, we didn't follow any pattern. Now the camel case here is actually a style that you can follow when it comes to creating variable names or identifiers as a whole. Now the pattern here is this. In this camel case, it actually involves joining words together to form the variable name, which we can already see here in this car Germany. So you can see that car is one word, Germany is another word entirely. So this is not an example of the camel case just yet, but this is exactly how the camel case does it. It just brings words together to form the variable name. So you can probably have something like my house address. It's actually three different words if you separate them. So in camel case, you bring them all together. But this is not the entire thing with camel case. But just know that in camel case, you join multiple words to form the identifier name in JavaScript. So now there are rules that you must follow when trying to use camel case. And the first rule is that the first word is entirely in lowercase. So the first word is entirely in lowercase. So in the case where we are trying to use the camel case style to, you know, we are trying to follow the pattern in creating our variable name, we must obey this first rule. And now the second rule here is that the first letter of the following words, that's the words that come after the first word, would be as of the following words will be in uppercase, and the rest of the word will be in lowercase. So this is actually just the rule we have when following the camel case style. So what this means is that if we're to use camel case to style, let's assume a variable name of my house address. The first word we have is my, so my is going to completely be in lowercase. Then for the next words, which is house, the very first letter of the second word, which is H, will be in uppercase, and the rest letters will be in lowercase. And then for the next word, which is address, the first letter, which is A, will be in uppercase, and the rest in lowercase. So this entire variable name we have here actually follows the camel case concept. You can also have this to be my, or let's just say username. You can have this to be user name. So you can see that user and name are two separate words. My and house and address are separate words. But the first word must be entirely in lowercase. And for the other words coming, let's have a very long variable name. So we'll call this, let's just leave this. We'll have a very, very long variable name. Probably call this my state of origin in my state. So now you can see a group of words have been brought together to form a variable name. And if you notice very well, we actually obeyed the rules of the identifiers. So my state of origin in my state, this is actually a variable name that consists of 7 words, seven different words. But then you can see for the very first word, which is my, it's entirely in lowercase. But for each of these other words following, their first letters are in uppercase. That's the S here in state, O here in off, O here in origin, the I here in the M in my, and also the S here in state. So by doing such, we've actually followed the camel case pattern in creating our identifier names. So you can see this is actually under the camel casing. So now for other types of casing, we have as other types of casing. We have this to begin with the Pascal case, and we also have the snake case. Snake case. Now, something here we should note is that the camel case is very, very popular with JavaScript programmers. So it's actually safe to say that since we're actually dealing with JavaScript, you should actually make use of the camel case more than these other cases I just listed here. But for the sake of knowledge, I'll just talk about them. So the Pascal case is actually similar to the camel case. The only difference here is that the entire words, that's all the words that have been put together, each of their first letters would be in uppercase. So if we were to convert this camel case here, that's this camel case styled word to Pascal case, we are going to have this my, the M here to be in capital letter, which is uppercase. So you can see my house address, each of these words here, they all have their first letters to be in uppercase. Also, if we were to change this to, following the Pascal case, we'll have the user here, that's the U, to be in uppercase, username. Likewise, my state of origin. The only thing it will be changing here will be the beginning, and here would have this to be in uppercase. So this is how it's done with the Pascal case. Now for the snake case, it's actually joins it doesn't join the words together. You actually have the words being connected by the underscore. So if we're to have that for the my house address, let's just change everything to you know small letters. So if we're to have it this way, in snake case, it will actually have the underscore separating each word. So you have the underscore here, my underscore house underscore address. Also for the username, as using the snake case, you have this to be user underscore name. And for the my state of origin in my state, I'm guessing for the snake case, you don't really have upper and lower case. It mostly uses lowercase all through or uppercase all through. My state of origin in my state. So here it will be my underscore state underscore of underscore origin underscore in underscore my and underscore state. So now we have my state of origin. So you can see that each of these variable names are actually being styled with different types of casing. Here we have the Pascal case. Here we have the camel case. Here we have the Pascal case, and here we have the snake case. So that's how it's done with casing. So the last thing for today's class would be on the last thing we talked about yesterday, which is how the let, var, and the const keyword work. Const as the constant keyword, how they work. Now we are going to be looking at this under two concepts. So the first concept will be the scope. The second will be reassigning, that's reassigning it a new value. New value. So for the first concept of scope, the scope here is actually defined as declaring whether you want to use a variable or how you want to use a variable. Now, we've actually been making use of variables, function names, and some of this. We've been making use of variables throughout the entire JavaScript file. But under this concept, we can actually define where we want to use a variable if we don't want it to be within the entire JavaScript file. So under the scope, we have the first scope, which is known as the block scope. The next scope is known as the functional scope. The functional scope. And the last is known as the global scope. So funny enough, all what we've been declaring with the variable names, we've actually been following the global scope, which means that we can actually make use of that variable anywhere in our JavaScript file. So let's quickly talk about the block scope first. So for the block scope actually makes use of what we call a block. That's what the block scope makes use of. Now, this block is actually being created by actually beginning with curly braces. So to create a block, you actually define it by, creating a set of curly braces. And within these curly braces, you would actually have your JavaScript code here. So now we'll start declaring with our keywords. We are making use of the underscore. Let's not call this name anymore. Man1. Give this name. Let's and two. Let's just add dollar sign for this. And also add the last keyword, which is the const keyword. Um, Now we've declared these variables within this block. So what happens here in the block scope is that we can actually access these particular variables we've declared within the block scope. So without wasting much time, we'll be making use of the document.write. Remember, the document.write is only for testing purposes. It's not really used in professional practice. You only use it to just test. So we'll be printing out the underscore man one.
Please, can't you use the dot get ID here?
O- okay, we can actually use that, but because of time factor, because we're actually way behind time. But then, okay, if that's what you want, not a problem. We'll have the get element by ID.
So that assigning ID to them, that's right.
Yeah. So now I'll go back to our HTML. I'll probably just declare some new paragraphs for the sake of this, you know, part. So call this P2, call this P3. So we'll be making reference to the first. Okay, I think we already have one for this P1, so let's call this P4 to be P4 with inner HTML. So we'd assign this with the value with the variable name is underscore man1. So the value assigned to this variable name is what would display on the screen. So this will be P3, P2, P3. So change this to man $2 to be man two. Yeah. So now if we save this and go back to our browser, okay, we have nothing here. Have we declared this name before? Hmm, probably. Okay, let me comment this out. So this is underscore man1, man2 $. I'm hoping we've not declared something like this before. Okay, we haven't. Okay, this doesn't seem to work and I do not know why. Okay, let's try accessing this outside the block. I just hope nothing here is stopping this. Okay, it seems like we have a lot of stuff here. Probably just need to comment everything out. Okay, so here we've actually declared and initialized each of these values within a block. So let's just go with the document or try just to test it. So for this, we'll begin with the very first variable name within the block, man underscore man1. Save this. Okay, so now we have James on the screen. So this actually works. Also, if we try to do this, the next one. So remember, this is just for testing purposes. It's not meant to be used, when you're working. And this for the last one. Let's go man two. So now we should expect to see all three values on the screen. Okay, yeah, so this is everything, James, Annette, and John. So by default, you know that the script tag is actually an inline level element. That's why you have all the values to be on the same line. So the reason why we had the block before was because they were rendered with p elements, which are actually block level elements. So the reason for this block scope now is the fact that you can actually reference your values within the scope, that's declaring it with the var, let, and const. But let's see what happens when we try to reference all three of them outside. How they are all outside the scope. So before I save this, one thing we should know here is that the var, the let, and the const keyword cannot be referenced outside the scope. So this actually means that only the var keyword can be referenced outside the scope. So what this means is that the only value we would see on the screen is just this James. You're not going to see Annette, you're not going to see John. So if I save this now and go back to our browser, we only have James on the screen, despite the fact that we had, all three values being printed with the document.write. So it's actually safer not to use the var keyword within a block, because the essence of this block now is to actually declare variables that you want them, when you want a variable to be only used within a portion of your code. You don't want it to be accessed outside. So this and this, using the let and the const, is actually better, because even when you try to reference it outside, it doesn't work. So, and by it not working, it will actually not, override any variable name like that already exists before. But with this var we have here, it can be referenced inside and outside, which is not so good. So in a case where we have another variable that has been declared, probably they have the same variable name but just declared with another keyword, the one declared there would override that one. So it can cause you issues within the code. So it's always safer not to use the var keyword within the block. It's better to use the let and the const within the block. So the next scope we'll be seeing is the functional scope. Now the functional scope makes use of a function. We already know what a function looks like when we're trying to, when we're dealing with JavaScript identifiers. So the function begins with the function keyword, which is then followed by the name we decide to give to the function. Call this my, okay, we've already used that. Let's just call this a function. Now you have next the brackets. This is actually for parameters, but then, like I said before, we're not dealing with functions in this class. We'll talk about functions properly in future classes. But for the sake of functional scope, I would just like to explain how it affects the var, the let, and the const keyword. Now we have our function. So we are going to copy this here. Would actually comment, copy this out, would declare them within the function. Also our var, just call this man to give this any value we want. Call this James again. So now we have this, and would also have this one inside the function. For this, we'll comment this since we don't need the block anymore. So now one thing to note here is that any variable declared with the var, the let, and the const can actually be, they can actually be referenced within the function. So this basically means that if I should save this and go back to our browser, we would get all this on the screen. Now, before we save this, another thing we should note here is that before a function can actually render, we should always call the function name. So calling the function name basically is, calling, the container that contains all these variables first. So just imagine it to be like a very big house that has an apartment inside. So obviously, before you can get to that apartment, you have to go through the house first. So without going to the house, there's no way you can get, to the apartment you want inside. So that means if I should actually save this now with this document.write, we've already gained access to these variables here, but we've not gained access to the function as a whole. So even if I save this and go back to the browser, you can see the entire screen is blank. There's nothing there. And that's because we've not accessed the function. We've only accessed the variable inside the function and not the function itself. So for us to do that, all we need to do is to call the variable name outside the function. And to do that, you just make use of the name of the variable, that I mean the name of the function, and also with the bracket. So you call a function by the function name. Sorry, not the variable name, the function name. We save this and you go back to the browser. Okay, why is this thing stunning? Okay, just keep stunning every time. Do we have an error? Oh, okay, yes, we do. This is man 2. Okay, so anytime now it should actually work. Okay, yes. So now we have James, Annette, and John. You can see all three values are printed on the screen. So you can see that case sensitivity is very important, and you should always take note of how you name the variables.
I'm sorry, if you put a semicolon at the end of the function after calling it out, this still display.
Okay, at the end of this, yeah, it should still, well, it still gives us the same result. So even with a semicolon, it actually still works. So one thing here we should note in the functional scope is that if we should try to reference these variable names that we have here outside the function, none of them is going to work. Not a single one of them would work. So now I'm going to take this out. I would have it outside here. If I save this and go back to the browser, not a single variable would render. And that's because in the functional scope, the function deals with, you know, whatever is defined there strictly. It strictly doesn't allow anything defined within itself to go outside. So it's actually best practice that when you are using the functional scope, you can actually make use of any of these keywords within the function. No need to worry, they can never be used outside. So for the last scope, we have the global scope. Now, like I said before, you might not know this, but before we touch the block scope and the functional scope, all the variables we've been declared have actually been using the global scope. And the global scope actually means that you can reference them even within a block and a function, even when you did not create them there. So for the purpose of this, we'll take this outside the function. Now we have them declared outside on its own. Okay, let's just make the variable, just put the global scope here. So now we have the variables declared outside. But if I should try to print them within this function, it's still going to work, despite the fact that they were not declared or initialized inside the function. So if I save this, going back to the browser, we have them on the screen, all of them. Now, if I should also take this out and take it to a block, let's create a block here. Within this block, we did not declare or initialize them. We are only just calling them. This would also, to still render. Save this, still appears on the browser. So this is how the different scope actually affect the different keywords. So you can see that for the global scope, the let and the const cannot be accessed outside except for the var keyword. For the functional scope, none of the keywords can be accessed outside. They all must be accessed strictly inside. And then for the global scope, they can be accessed anywhere within a function, within a block, anywhere. So without wasting our time, the last thing for today's class, that's for the second concept, we have reassigning a new value. So we'll also make use of these variables we've declared and initialized here. Now we have this. So you already know what would happen if I save this and go back to the browser. They would all print the default values they were initialized with. That's the James, Annette, and John. So the next thing I'll be doing, I'll be changing the values of the var. So all I just need to do is to say man2 is equals to a new value. Instead of this to be James, I'll call it Mary. Now if I comment this out, and we should only print, just the one with that was declared with the var keyword to actually change the value to Mary. So you can see that it can be assigned a new value anytime you want. And now the value doesn't have to be of the same data type because both of them are of string types. We can call this man too with a number type. Just say 2022. Save, go back to the browser. It gives us 2022. So you can see that you can assign it a new value with a new type, and that's because JavaScript is called a loosely typed language. So what this means is that the data type of this value is not really attached to the variable. The variable can always accept a new data type and a new value. So we'll also try this with the underscore man too. We'll assign this another value, semi, and if we should uncomment this value here would override this one we have here, which is Annette. And now you have the value here. And as I said before, you can even change it to an entirely new value with a new data type. 5. It does the same thing. You can see we have 2022 and 45 here. So you can see that both the let and the var keyword can actually allow their variables to be assigned with a new value. But the const keyword would not accept that. So let's try changing underscore man to a new value, Freddy. Now this would actually not only, it would not just not work, but it would also affect even the ones that are working. So if I save this now, instead of these other ones to render and this one not to appear, the entire thing won't even appear at all. And people were here yesterday, we saw that. So now you can see the entire screen is blank, despite the fact that these two were working initially. So this actually caused an error that affected even the ones that were working. So this is one of the reasons why you need to be very, very careful when programming with JavaScript. So never ever try to assign a variable that has been declared with the const keyword again. So if I should comment this out, would actually have the values that were working before on the screen. So I guess that's that for today's class. So thank you all.